Hi, everybody. Welcome to, what is it, the 7th episode of the Read, Write, Mike podcast. And of course, right now we're focusing on the vocabulary curriculum. And last week we took a little pause going through each activity to talk about can you do vocabulary solely in reading workshop? The answer was yes and no. Listening back on that episode, I think I was so frantic and discombobulated. I was in a different city. When I put that out, I was talking about how the 4 different ways to acquire vocabulary, how they can appear in or out of reading workshop. And I forgot to get to the number 1. So the number 1 is reading widely, right? Reading widely is a great way, as I've talked about in previous episodes, to gain a breadth of words, and learning individual words is a way to grow a depth of words. And the learning individual words occurs outside of reading workshop predominantly, but reading a breadth across genres is a great way to get a lot of words, albeit at a shallow level. And of course, that's in reading workshop. So really the number one way to acquire vocabulary words is to read widely. So reading workshop's got a lot going for it. One of the reasons that I've put out this vocabulary curriculum is to complement that, to get even more vocabulary acquisition going on top of what's already happening in reading workshop. And it's just the one thing that's missing from reading workshop, which is learning individual words deeply. And that's what teachers have been asking for. And that's what I've provided. So we'll move on. Today's episode, we're going to continue looking over the vocabulary games, the activities. And in this category, what we'll go over is called Beck, McKeon, and Kukin call word associations. And my best analogy that I think I can come up with for word associations is this. Well, first we have example, non-example that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where you teach kids a word and then you give them certain situations or examples, and they have to basically say yes or no. Does what I say fit with this word? It's very yay or nay. It's very binary, right, wrong answer. Although, as we've learned, there's some wiggle room in there. You can give a very creative answer as long as you show you know what the word means. Word associations are a way for kids to practice a little bit more deeply. And the analogy I like to use is the analogy of like the old switchboard operator, which I'm sure you've seen on old, movie reels and, old photographs where, somebody places a call and the switchboard operator, takes the call and patches you into somebody else, right? And so they take a plug, they pull out of one plug and they put it in the other to connect you. And that's kind of what kids are doing a little bit, because they have this bank of words now that you've taught them and you're still providing examples. But now what they're doing is they're kind of like the switchboard operator, connecting the words to the right examples. It's more of a connection, much like a switchboard operator. And so there are 3 main word association games that you'll see in the curriculum. The 3 are these in terms of pilot popularity. Number 1, I call put in a sub. Number 2, I call matching mentions. That is matching mentions. And number 3, I call famous and familiar. And let's get started by talking about each. First, we'll talk about put in a sub. So put in a sub is pretty straightforward. And I think that's probably why it was one of the more popular games among the pilots last year. And essentially what you do is you give a sentence that has a synonym that's written as a synonym for the vocabulary words that you're teaching. So the goal is to invite kids to restate the sentence using one of the vocabulary words. And you'll notice that one of the new things for the revised version of the curriculum is that across the bends, if you choose to use put in a sub, you will see that it will incorporate words from bends 1 and bends 2 and so forth, so that you get a little spaced practice, a little interleaving practice, as the cognitive scientists would call it. And the thing that I also realized with put in a sub is you want to make sure, if you're going to make your own, right, which is always an invitation after you've used this curriculum, is to make sure the sentences are brief, especially if you're just saying them out loud so kids can remember them and then switch out the word. Or you could display the sentences so that it's a little bit easier for kids to restate the sentence with the word. And one new thing also is, for extra help, I have highlighted the word that you want to put in a sub for. And so it's very clear where it is that you want the kids to sub the word. So you just, she didn't get me to believe her. Now that one's going to be kind of tricky because get's kind of a vague verb, but you take a look at the word bank, and then you would restate it. And you probably say, gosh, I'm doing this live, so I'm going to, she didn't convince me to believe her, right? Now you notice it's not always going to be direct synonyms. You're going to have sometimes, verbs that probably have like 30 different definitions in which you can swap out the word, but you use other context in that sentence to understand what would it be. So, get is a very vague verb, doesn't very, easily let you know that convince is the word, but that idea of belief, right? Getting somebody to believe in what you're saying will be the clue there. And then, of course, whenever students restate something or you do something in any of these games, you want to invite them to say why. Okay, next we are going to talk about the game matching mentions and famous and familiar. So when we're talking about the next two word association games, matching mentions and famous and familiar, one of those games is going to be wildly similar to put in a sub, but it's a little bit different. And I'll explain why. And that word or that game is matching mentions. Let's take a look at it. So here you can see, if you're watching the video version of this on YouTube, you can see that the first option, you can see put in a sub, is right next to matching mentions, right? And so whereas put in a sub is you restate the sentence using that word, right? And so it's going to have a one-to-one synonym. Matching mentions is like what would make, or not what would make somebody say this, but if somebody said this, what word does it connect to? So it's kind of like somebody's mentioning something and what does it relate to? So you can see how it's similar to put in a sub, but it's a little bit different. So if you're creating your own matching mentions, you can write a little bit longer of a sentence, because generally it's a sentence that you're just kind of hearing and getting the gist of. You don't have to rephrase it. Sometimes I've noticed that when kids have to rephrase something, it's a little bit trickier because they have to memorize the order in which the words in which it was said. But if it's just matching mentions, you can be like, oh, in general, it has to do with this, right? And so the sentences can be a little bit longer, but it's also going to be, they're like quotes. Like what if somebody said this, what does it connect to? So you can see it's a little bit similar to put in a sub, but also a little bit different. And again, this one was a very popular word association game amongst the pilots. And I think it's this idea that now you're just sort of connecting the word to an example. And you can see how that's a little bit different from just saying yes or no when I provide an example, which is what example non-examples do that we've talked about in previous episodes. Now let's talk about the last one, game, famous and familiar. This one was, I wouldn't say, well, technically was the least popular, but they're all popular. Overwhelmingly, the pilots enjoyed all the games, but it got the least favorable votes. And I think it was because it was tricky. It was tricky to kind of figure out. And I think famous and familiar is tricky for several reasons. And I think it's one of those things where you'll have to figure out how it works best for you. And I think if you're learning a new curriculum, sometimes that creativity doesn't come right away. But as you use the curriculum, week after week, month after month, you'll find a way to make famous and familiar be a lot of fun. And it's a great way because what you're doing is you're using common experiences in popular culture. So let's take a look at an example of famous and familiar. So one thing you'll notice about famous and familiar right away is it's one of the more longer described games. It takes up almost a full page on the curriculum. And so let's zoom in and take a look at each portion of it so that it just feels like it makes a little bit more sense. So the first part of famous and familiar, you get students to talk about popular culture and common life experiences so that you can have a bank that you can draw from. Now, frankly, you could do this outside of the vocabulary curriculum as you're getting to know kids at the beginning of the year, but it's something you want to keep an eye on throughout the year because popular culture changes. By definition, it's something that always changes. And so when I've given out first drafts and pilots of these, a lot of times by the time I pass out the curriculum to teachers, that popular culture figure is no longer popular and kids may not know them. And it's simple things like we might know, like Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift and what have you. But the thing about popular culture is always changing. Even the video games, a few years ago, Fortnite, I could use in this curriculum. Minecraft seems to have a lot of staying power, but the thing is, you always have to keep your ear to the ground. So I think that's one thing that makes famous and familiar tricky, is you have to keep your ear to the ground to popular culture, which by definition is always changing. Another thing you can do is thinking of common experiences. And the thing about common experiences is there are some that are common to all of us across our American culture, but then there's some that are particular to communities and cultures, right? What people do, where people worship, how, what kids do when they go home and how they hang out and how they spend their free time is very similar in a lot of ways, but it can be different from community to community. And so this would be, using your knowledge of students and what they like to do and what they do with their families when they're not at school can help. But essentially, once you have that list of things, then what you do is you just take you're the switchboard operator. You connect your vocabulary word to that particular popular culture or common experience. So you'll see in the examples it says famous pop star singer, but put in the pop star singer's name, if their kids have one. If there's a popular video game that's out, I know past year was Among Us, but is Among Us still popular, right? What will be the new game? But actually put in the game, not just a popular video game. You're going to want to put in the actual name, eating at a restaurant, some of those things. Gosh, before COVID, some of those things were pretty common. And now, perhaps they're a little bit less common, but, making dinner or eating dinner with family or something can be something that's more common. But the idea is you're going to have to do a little legwork. And as you get to know your students, to do this one well. And it's a great opportunity because the more students get to know you and the more you get to know students, the more you build what's called teacher clarity, or not teacher clarity, excuse me, teacher credibility, right? This idea, it's the top 10 influence on student achievement. It is this idea that kids' perception of us, whether or not we're a legit teacher and I want to learn from you, this idea is really powerful. And simply getting to know kids and having them get to know us is one way to build your teacher credibility. And so that's good for life. It's good for teaching. It's good for kids' achievement in vocabulary, but also everything. All right. So those are the word association games that you'll see throughout the curriculum. I'll send some feedback as to see which ones your favorites are. I think famous and familiar has a lot of opportunity to be creative. And it's a little bit getting to know your kids, but matching mentions and put in a sub are pretty straightforward as well. Well, that brings us to the end, colleagues. Take care, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.